So sunny, but still beautiful spring afternoon. My name's Ann Powley. I'm the chair of the Mahwah Historic Preservation Commission, and I'm so glad you could join us today with Dr. Moralez to tell us a little bit about the history of slavery in New Jersey. So I wanted to just start. Is everyone familiar with the Historic Preservation Commission? I don't know how much of a following we have. I hope you'll check us out on Facebook. We're part of township government. So we are a volunteer commission. There's 11 of us. And our job is to preserve the historic sites in town. So most of them are physical structures, but we also have part of our mission to educate the public about some of Mahwah's history, and that's where the idea for this talk was born. And I feel like the light is right in my eye, so bear with me. We were working on two projects, so in addition to preserving buildings, we also care for several cemeteries that have been abandoned and are no longer cared for. And one is an abandoned slave cemetery, which is, I'm always like a little cautious about sharing the location, but I don't think this crew is going to go out there and drink and vandalize and take stones. So it's along Route 202 behind what is currently the sculpture center for the college, near, if you know, that beautiful little stone house, the Hopper Van Horn house. So back along the river, there's a small plot. It has about 30 unmarked stones, and these were believed to be the slaves of the Hopper family. There are 3 beautiful larger stones which were added later, and those were from freedmen who still worked for the family. And as we get into the talk today, I think Isabella is going to explain a little bit about what a freed person was. So we worked with a Boy Scout last summer to restore that site. He went in and helped cut down a lot of brush. It had been completely overgrown. You couldn't even see the stones anymore. He helped repair the rock wall. We did a lot of tree work. And I definitely found myself a little surprised to know that we had slavery in Mahwah. I always had thought of it as more of a southern issue. I thought that when slavery was coming to an end, Black people who were freed made their way north, but I didn't realize how prevalent it was in the state of New Jersey. We had another project that wasn't quite as successful. We have the burial site of Cynthia Hesdra. She is credited as being a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and she is buried here in Mahwah, which I just found absolutely fascinating. She was born to a freed, her father was not enslaved, her mother was enslaved, and at some point in her life, she was enslaved. And again, my lack of knowledge, I found it so hard to understand. How could you be born of a free parent and then be enslaved at some point in your life, not understanding anything about the history of the Fugitive Slave Act or what being a freed person meant. So I wanted to learn more about the local history. And that's what led me to Dr. Moralez. Doing research online, there is the Princeton's History and Slavery Project, which I encourage you to check out online. I started to learn a little more about some of the laws that were enacted and how people who could have been held as slaves could have been taken back into slavery after they were freed. So I wanted to have a more fuller understanding of what life was like during this period. And I'm so grateful she's agreed to come and speak with us. Dr. Moralez is the Education and Exhibit Manager at the Stoutsburg-Sauerland African American Museum. This is Central New Jersey's first dedicated Black History Museum. She's the founding editor of Princeton University's public history initiative, the Princeton and Slavery Project. And she's written her first book called Happy Dreams of Liberty, An American Family in Slavery and Freedom. The book's won numerous awards, including the prestigious Frederick Douglass Book Prize from Yale University's Gilder Lehrman Center. If you stay to the end, she's got some copies here for sale. And I know she's going to dive a little bit more into her book as well. So I'd love to welcome Dr. Moralez. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for coming on a somewhat gloomy Saturday, and thank you, Ann, for your introduction. I'm delighted to be here. As Ann said, I'm Isabela Moralez. I'm an author and historian of slavery, and my book, which I hope to save a little time to talk about later, is the story of an enslaved family in Alabama. but I have also spent the last decade researching and writing about the history of slavery in New Jersey. Now, I am not a Jersey girl by birth. I grew up in California and then attended college at the University of Alabama before moving to Princeton to pursue my PhD in 2012. That year, my dissertation advisor advised me to join a research project that she was spearheading at the university, what would become the Princeton and Slavery Project. Now, some of you may be familiar with our work already, probably most of you are not. It is an in-depth historical investigation of Princeton University and the surrounding community's historical entanglement with the institution of slavery. Now, many colleges and universities have conducted similar slavery studies over the past couple decades, but ours is one of the most expansive. We conducted our initial research between 2013 and 2017 when we launched our website, and we continued to publish new stories and new research to the site up until this year, 2024. In total, the website contains more than 100 deeply researched interpretive essays about slavery, enslaved people, and the long history of systemic racism at Princeton, in the town of Princeton, and throughout New Jersey at large. That's the equivalent of more than 1,000 printed pages, which is why we didn't publish it as a book like many other universities have done. It would be a little unwieldy. We also have a digital archive online with more than 400 primary sources uploaded, and all of this is free and accessible to the public. So if you're interested in learning more about slavery in New Jersey, as clearly you are since you're here today, I highly encourage you to check out our website, slavery.princeton.edu. It is an excellent resource, and I don't just say it because I edited everything on it. When I started working on the Princeton and Slavery Project, I really knew very little about slavery in this state or in the North in general. I thought this was because I'm from California. You know, when I was in elementary school and middle school, we learned about the Spanish missions and the gold rush. I assumed that if I had been raised in New Jersey, I would have learned about the state's history of slavery. Turned out I was wrong about that. I currently work at SAM, that's what we call it for short, the Stoutsburg-Sauerland African American Museum. SAM is, for now, the first and only Black History Museum in central New Jersey. And as part of my job, I often give tours, both to student groups and groups of adults born and raised in the area. And without fail, every tour group includes at least one person who hadn't known that slavery existed in New Jersey until they got to the museum or until they looked up the museum before their tour. Most of them didn't know just how extensive New Jersey was in the state and how important it was to the state's society and economy and development. Now, I won't ask anyone here to raise their hand and tell me when they first learned about slavery in New Jersey. It hasn't been taught in schools until very recently, and even today that information isn't always easy to find. Fortunately, more and more museums and historic sites are sharing these previously untold stories. I was very excited to hear about what Anne shared a moment ago, the work that the Mahwah Historic Preservation Commission and the Mahwah Museum are doing to preserve and share Black history in this area, the burial site of Cynthia Hesdra and the slave cemetery in Mahwah. This is fantastic work. And today I'd like to contextualize that work with a larger history of slavery in New Jersey, starting way back at the beginning when New Jersey first became a British colony in 1664. Now, many people get the impression from popular culture that slavery was somehow worse in the South, even if it existed in the North. Movies like 12 Years a Slave, TV shows like Roots take place in the South. The North is the place that enslaved people run to when they try to escape. But before the American Revolution, slavery was a fact of life in every British North American colony, and that includes New Jersey. In 1664, the first governing documents of the colony granted white English settlers up to 150 acres of free land for every enslaved person they owned and brought to the colony. The more enslaved people you own, the more free land. This means that slavery wasn't only legal in New Jersey, it was actively encouraged and promoted. From the very beginning, the policies and laws of the colony were designed to spread slavery and make it stronger. Slave ships carrying hundreds upon hundreds of kidnapped Africans docked in ports along the Delaware River and at the Perth Amboy waterfront before being sold all across the colony. On the eve of the American Revolution, more than 8,200 enslaved people lived and labored in New Jersey. This was one of the largest enslaved populations in the Northeast. It was second only to New York. And the narrative we often hear about slavery in the North is that during and after the Revolution, ideals of liberty and equality led to the end of slavery in this region, so that it only existed in the South after that period. And New Jersey certainly has an illustrious revolutionary history. More battles took place in New Jersey than any of the other 13 colonies. Today, you can hardly take a walk without tripping over a historic marker commemorating one of those battles or a site where George Washington's men slept one evening. And I'm not saying this isn't important, but celebrating New Jersey's role in the fight for liberty without also acknowledging its deep history of slavery is just one side of the story. The story is incomplete. African Americans are a part of that history and always have been. Now, despite the state's commitment to the revolutionary cause, New Jersey didn't abolish slavery immediately after the war. In fact, quite the opposite happened. By 1800, when other northern states were passing emancipation laws, New Jersey's enslaved population was growing from 8,200 people before the war to 12,400. Now in Bergen County, between 1772 and 1800, the number of enslaved people doubled. Bergen County was the largest slaveholding county in the state, and at that time, enslaved people made up 20% of the total population. That's a huge number when you consider that enslaved people made up 6% of all of New Jersey population. So what kind of work did enslaved people do in New Jersey? Well, the answer really is everything. Enslaved people labored in every economic sector: urban workshops, stores and taverns, mines and quarries, at the docks, in orchards. New Jersey had a major peach agricultural industry, so in peach orchards, on farms and plantations, because there were plantations in New Jersey. When we talk about slavery and agricultural labor, a plantation is usually defined as a farm with 20 or more enslaved laborers, and that sort of farm certainly existed in the state of New Jersey, even if they didn't grow crops that we normally associate with the word plantation, like sugar or cotton or tobacco in the South. Now, perhaps this is why New Jersey was the last northern state to pass an anti-slavery law. Vermont abolished slavery in 1777, very early in the American Revolution. In 1780, Pennsylvania passed a Gradual Emancipation Act, and Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and other northern states followed in the next few years. Even New York, which had the largest enslaved population in the North, passed a Gradual Emancipation Act in 1799. New Jersey was the last, passing its first anti-slavery law only in 1804. Now, in the United States, slavery followed the condition of the mother, and this might get to Anne's question about Cynthia Hedra's status as an enslaved person. In the US, no matter whether your father was black or white, enslaved or free, if your mother was enslaved, you were born into slavery as well. The 1804 Gradual Emancipation Act stated that any baby girl born to an enslaved woman after July 4th, 1804, of course, would be freed at age 21, and any boy born after that date would be freed at age 25. That gave slave owners essentially a generation to get used to the idea of paying for labor. However, the law did not free any person born before July 4th, 1804. And because of this restriction, there were still enslaved people in the state until the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the passage of the 13th Amendment. To put it another way, slavery existed in New Jersey for as long as it did in many southern states that rebelled as part of the Confederacy. Now, speaking of the Civil War, between 60,000 and 80,000 New Jersey men fought for the Union Army during the Civil War, and 3,000 of those men were African Americans who enlisted in the United States colored troops. Now, for African Americans, military service was often seen as a way to prove that they were equal to white men, as courageous as white soldiers, as ready to fight and die for American ideals, and therefore as worthy of equal civil rights after the war. Fighting to end slavery and free people in bondage in the South was another strong motivation. Next month, we'll celebrate Juneteenth, which commemorates the day that a Union general, General Granger, marched his soldiers into Galveston, Texas, and freed the last enslaved people in the country, a month after the end of the Civil War. African American soldiers were with him on that day, including a New Jersey man named Aaron Trueheart, who served in the 127th Regiment, whose flag you can see here. Aaron Trueheart was himself the descendant of an enslaved person, Friday Trueheart, who was born into slavery in South Carolina, but transported to New Jersey by his enslaver in 1780, when Friday was just 13 years old. Now, unfortunately, New Jersey also had its share of pro-slavery, even pro-Confederacy residents. At Princeton University, more than 600 students and alumni enlisted in one military or the other during the Civil War, and more than half of those students chose to fight for the Confederacy. New Jersey in general had a reputation for being more friendly to Southerners and to pro-slavery ideologies than any other northern state. One 19th century college student transferring from Andover in Massachusetts to Princeton wrote that he felt Andover was rather too far north in comparison, and that he was eager to get into society a little more southern, or at any rate, a society not so entirely northern. That's New Jersey, a little more southern than the rest of the Northeast. Another student writing to his parents about Princeton President John McLean said, "Dr. McLean reminds me more of one of our hospitable Southern gentlemen than almost any person with whom I have met here." Because of New Jersey's hospitable reputation, Southern slave owners preferred to send their sons to Princeton for their education rather than Harvard, Yale, or other New England schools. This map, okay, good. The colors weren't showing up on this screen. I want to make sure you can see it. This map shows the state of origin for Princeton students from the class of 1859, shortly before the Civil War. As you can see, every southern state is represented, including a student from California at a very early period. And this is representative of the student body at Princeton before 1864. Between the school's founding in 1746 and the end of the Civil War, Southerners made up about 40% of the total student population. Some years that number reached 50 or even 60%. Compare that to Harvard and Yale, who had a Southern student population of 9 and 11%, respectively. Pro-Southern political sentiment was not limited to Princeton's campus either. New Jersey was not an abolitionist stronghold. That's clear from the fact that we were the last northern state to pass an anti-slavery law. We were also the only northern state not to vote for Abraham Lincoln in the 1860 election. New Jersey was as culturally Southern as a northern state could get. Now, these are the basic facts, dates, and numbers about slavery in New Jersey. But as an author and a historian, I'm more interested in enslaved people. What were their names? What were their lives like? And answering these kind of questions can be very difficult because the historical sources we have about enslaved people are so limited. Now, there are a handful of autobiographies written by former slaves. Here you see abolitionist and activist Frederick Douglass, musician Solomon Northrop, teacher Harriet Jacobs, and Elizabeth Keckley, who would become Mary Todd Lincoln's dressmaker at the White House after she was freed. All of these people were enslaved at some point in their lives, and all of them wrote rich, moving narratives of their experiences that are very valuable sources for anyone who wants to learn about the institution of slavery during that period. None of these individuals, however, were enslaved in New Jersey, but we do have Sylvia Dubois. Has anyone here heard the name Sylvia Dubois before? Okay, great. You're gonna love this. Sylvia was born into slavery on Sourland Mountain, which is about 70 miles southwest of here in central New Jersey, sometime in the late 1700s. Now, the exact date of her birth isn't known because, as with most enslaved people, records of her birth were not kept. Estimates for her birth year, however, range from 1767 to the 1780s. And when she died in 1888, she may have been as old as 120, and she was certainly over 100 years old. Now, when she was a younger woman, Sylvia worked in the tavern of her enslaver, a Pennsylvania man named Dominicus, or Minna Dubois. Minna's wife was incredibly violent and abusive towards Sylvia. On one occasion, she hit Sylvia with a coal shovel so hard that it cracked her skull. Now, one day, after years of this mistreatment, Sylvia decided she had had enough. When Mrs. Dubois attempted to hit her that day, she fought back and knocked the woman out in the middle of the tavern. Now, when he got home, you might imagine that Minna Dubois might have punished Sylvia by beating her or even by selling her. Instead, he seemed to decide that this woman was too much trouble, and so he actually freed her. Which is why when a local man interviewed Sylvia and wrote her oral history in 1883, he called the book "The Slave Who Whipped Her Mistress and Gained Her Freedom," because that's what she did. Now, after she was freed, Sylvia returned to her birthplace, the Sourland Mountain, and worked in another tavern called Putt's Tavern. This tavern was owned by her grandfather, a free black man named Harry Putnam. And Putt's Tavern was considered a very rowdy place. So Sylvia, who was already known for her physical strength, she had the reputation of being able to knock a man out with one punch, was hired as the bouncer. Now, Sylvia herself was not literate, so this book is as close as we can get to her life story in her own words, even if it was dictated and transcribed by a local white man. So we don't know, what biases or perspective he would have put onto her words. This is still, the closest we have to kind of a New Jersey biography of an enslaved person. But she is, of course, an exceptional case. Most enslaved people didn't have biographies written about them. Most of them, like Sylvia, were denied an education, so they couldn't write letters or diaries or other documents that we might use today to learn about their lives. Most of the records that we have related to enslaved people are related to their legal status as property. That means wills, inventories, account books, and appraisals. These sources might provide a name, a date of birth, or they might not. Countless enslaved people are known only today as anonymous tally marks on a census schedule or the manifest of a slave ship. One particularly rich source of information we do have, however, comes from runaway slave advertisements. Now, in the 18th and 19th centuries, when an enslaved person ran away seeking freedom, perhaps to be reunited with family they were sold away from or to get back to their native homes, slave owners often placed advertisements in the newspaper offering a reward for the return of their human property. In these ads, enslavers described the fugitives, and often in great detail: name, age, height, physical appearance, the clothes they were wearing when they were last seen, and skills they might have had. These ads were created for an inhumane purpose, to prevent men, women, and children from finding freedom. But ironically, the details in these advertisements are a goldmine for those of us who want to learn about enslaved individuals as people, as human beings. Now, these images here come from a website called Freedom on the Move, which has collected and published more than 32,000 runaway ads from newspapers across the United States. Now, in preparation for this talk, I searched their database for ads with the phrase New Jersey, and I got 160 results. When I searched Bergen County, I got 17 results. That's 17 stories of real people, enslaved people, who lived in Bergen County and tried to escape their lives in bondage. And I'd like to share a few of those today. Nell was an enslaved woman from Saddle River. She ran away in April 1753, so this is 2 decades before the American Revolution. The ad describes her as a Negro wench, offensive language we would not use today, but which was commonly used by white people, especially in the slave trade, to describe black women. And you'll find language like this in virtually every ad. The ad also says that Nell had 3 diamonds in her face, one on each side and the other on her forehead. And what the author means here is that she was tattooed. A white woman in 18th century England or New Jersey would never tattoo her face. But many enslaved people kidnapped from Africa arrived in North America with body markings like tattoos or scarification that reflected their traditions and cultures. By mentioning Nell's diamonds, this advertisement tells us that she was probably born in Africa and survived the Middle Passage. She was very far from home. Ben ran away from his enslaver in Newark in 1766. He was described as being 5'8" or 9", with a narrow face and slender frame. The ad also tells us that he spoke Dutch. Now, the Dutch were the earliest slave owners in this region. New York, of course, was originally New Amsterdam, and North Jersey, before it became a part of the British colonies of New Jersey, was part of the colony of New Netherland. So the fact that Ben spoke Dutch as well as English provides insight into the multicultural world that he lived in during the colonial period. Now, the ad tells us that Ben had run away from a previous enslaver in Bergen County before he was sold to Richards in Newark. So this wasn't the first time that he tried to escape. This time, however, he was determined not to be caught. He told Richards that he was going out to take a swim. The next day, his clothes were found by the shore, and it was assumed that he had drowned. But when Richards discovered that Ben had run away from his last enslaver, he realized that he had probably been tricked. By faking his own death, Ben bought himself valuable time because his enslaver didn't send out a search party until a day or more after the escape. Mahwah, also known as Amarita, was born in 1746. Now, the fact that she has 2 names listed in the runaway advertisement indicates to me that one of them was probably the name that her parents gave her or that she used within the enslaved community, and one was the name that her enslaver called her by. I suspect that Amarita was her original name. Mahwah was a very popular English name at the time. Spelled like this, we would probably pronounce it Maria, but in English colonies it would have been pronounced as if it were spelled with an H at the end, like Mariah. Amarita is more likely Spanish in origin, and since there were not many Spaniards in colonial New Jersey, it could mean that this woman was born in the Caribbean before she was sold north into New Jersey. Perhaps her parents came from the Caribbean and so therefore gave her a more Spanish-inflected name. Today, interestingly, the name Amarita is most popular in Namibia, Nigeria, and Kenya, which could also indicate that this woman, like Nell, was born in Africa or that her parents were and gave her a name from their traditions. Now, in 1780, when Mahwah or Amarita was 34 years old, she fled her enslaver, John Duffield, in Philadelphia. Notably, she made her escape on Christmas Day, a day enslaved people traditionally had off of work, meaning she was less likely to be missed. It was a way to buy time, like Ben had done. Duffield believed that she was trying to get back to New Jersey, where her previous enslaver lived. It is very likely she had family there that she hadn't seen since she was sold. Duffield suspected, however, that she hadn't actually gotten very far and was in fact still hiding in the city. In 1780, Philadelphia had one of the largest free black populations in the United States. This was a place where an enslaved woman like Mahwah or Emerita could blend in and pretend to be free, or where free African Americans might help her. Duffield believes that's who was hiding her in the city. Now, one especially pressing reason that Mahwah might have felt the need to hide was because she had escaped with her 4-year-old daughter, Jane. Now, the vast majority of runaways in these advertisements are men traveling alone. Traveling with children made you easier to identify on the road. And of course, a child too young to understand what was happening might cry or act up at an inconvenient moment. In general, enslaved women were far less likely to attempt to run away because they were less willing to leave their children behind. The fact that Mahwah or Emerita took Jane with her was both incredibly brave and incredibly dangerous. Now, we don't know whether any of these enslaved individuals were ever recaptured or whether they escaped their bondage permanently and were able to build new lives for themselves in freedom. Slave owners didn't place advertisements in the paper announcing that they had given up searching for a runaway. But they did publish notices when they captured African Americans who they suspected of being fugitives from slavery. In 1807, the sheriff of Cecil County, Maryland, apprehended and imprisoned an African American man and woman upon suspicion of being runaways. They didn't know these people. The man's name was Robert Finley. He was 5'9.5", and the ad describes him as having a yellow complexion. Again, this was racist terminology meant to provide a physical description. It indicated that he was light-skinned. Robert told his jailers that he had been born free in New Jersey, but they didn't believe him. Now, the woman with him is not named, but she was identified as Robert's wife. She was 5'2.5", and she told them that she was born in Philadelphia. Like her husband, she was described as having a yellow complexion. And Robert and his wife may very well have been telling the truth. As we saw with Mahwah or Emerita, Philadelphia had a very large free black population, and Mrs. Finley, if she were born in Philadelphia, could have been one of them. But the Finleys in this world were not innocent until proven guilty. They were assumed to be slaves, and it was up to them to prove that they weren't. Because they had no papers showing that they were free and no white person to vouch for them, Robert and his wife were imprisoned and put up for auction to the highest bidder. This unnamed enslaved man was captured in Bergen County on May 19, 1779, 225 years and 1 day ago. He told his jailers in New Jersey that he was from Virginia and that he had run away from his master 3 years before, in 1776, to join Lord Dunmore. Now, 1776, of course, marks the start of the American Revolution, and while white patriots believed that they were fighting for freedom, many African Americans saw the war very differently. During the Revolution, somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 African American and Native American men fought for the Continental Army, George Washington's army. In some cases, they were inspired by the rhetoric of liberty and equality in the air in the papers at that time. In others, their enslavers promised to free them after the war if they fought in their stead. But more than 20,000 African Americans fought for the British. This was the work of Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia at the time the war broke out. In 1775, he issued Dunmore's Proclamation, which promised freedom for all runaway slaves who joined the British side. As you can see here, it's interesting to note that the black men fighting on the British side were the ones who had liberty to slaves emblazoned on their uniforms. Now, when the war ended, the Americans, of course, won. And the British did attempt to keep their promise. 3,000 black loyalists were able to leave the United States for British-controlled Canada where they could be free. This unnamed soldier who was captured in Bergen County in 1779, however, didn't make it to Canada. The advertisement that appeared in the New Jersey Gazette stated that he would be held in jail for 8 weeks or until his enslaver from Virginia came to claim him. If no one came to claim him, he wouldn't be set free. He would, like Robert Finley and his wife, be sold to pay for the cost of his imprisonment. Every community across the Northeast and the South have stories just like these about ordinary people, enslaved men and women, seeking freedom, opportunity, and equality. Yet these stories often go untold. That's what my book is about, and I promised I would get to this. Happy Dreams of Liberty is the story of one family, the Townsends, and their journey from slavery to freedom, from Alabama to the American West, Midwest, and North, and from the antebellum period to the rise of Jim Crow. I was very fortunate while writing this book to have access to more sources than usual for an enslaved family. Some of the Townsends were able to receive a formal education, so they wrote letters in their own words that have been preserved in the archive. They were also the subject of a number of lawsuits, and legal documents are another valuable, if sometimes dry, historical source about slavery and the lives of enslaved people. But who were the Townsends? They are not a family that you were likely to find in any history book. The Townsends I wrote about were the enslaved children of 2 white cotton planter brothers, Samuel and Edmund Townsend, and 7 enslaved women whom they owned on their vast Madison County, Alabama plantations in the decades before the Civil War. This meant that the Townsends weren't just Samuel and Edmund's children, they were also legally their property. Now, that's not what made the Townsends unusual. Enslaved women in the South and North during the time of slavery were incredibly vulnerable to rape and abuse from men like the Townsend brothers who held such extreme power over their lives. What was unusual about the Townsend family was how Samuel and Edmund viewed the children of these women whom they had abused. As one neighbor recalled a conversation with Samuel, quote, "He spoke kindly and tenderly of his children and said that they never should serve anybody." Now, neither brother ever married, so they had no wives or legitimate white children to carry on their legacy. These enslaved children were the only heirs they would ever have, and unlike many slave owners who had enslaved children, in the Townsends' minds, that's what they were, their rightful heirs despite their legal status as slaves. When Edmund died in 1853, he attempted to leave his 2 sons and 2 daughters almost the entirety of his $500,000 fortune. Now that's $500,000 in 1856 money. Today, that would be worth $17 million. This was the largest bequest from a slave owner to enslaved people in Alabama history. Now, Edmund had been so wealthy and powerful during his lifetime and had such a reputation for violence when crossed that no one had ever dared to challenge him. So he probably didn't expect that anyone would challenge his wishes after he died, and in that, he was wrong. A white man having enslaved children didn't fundamentally upset the rules of white supremacy because the children and the mothers of those children remained enslaved. As long as wealth and power remained firmly in the hands of white slave owners, mixed-race children like the Townsends could be overlooked. Allowing these children to join the ranks of the elite, however, granting them freedom and hundreds of thousands of dollars, now that crossed a line. In 1853, Edmund's white relatives, his nieces and nephews, contested his will in court, and they won. Edmund's children were not emancipated, and they did not receive their inheritance. Samuel, the younger brother, watched all of this happen. And for his will, because he was also on his deathbed, he brought in reinforcements. He hired a man named Septimus Cabanis, a successful Huntsville attorney, to make his will airtight against the inevitable lawsuits and challenges that he knew his white relatives would bring against it. In the mid-19th century, emancipating enslaved people in some southern states like Alabama, this was extremely difficult, and that was by design. white Alabama residents didn't want there to be a large free black population in the state. They thought that would lead to slave rebellions and political upheaval. The question of a large free black population was one of the things that also motivated lawmakers in New Jersey to pass such a restrictive gradual emancipation act. The idea is if you free all these enslaved people immediately, well, they're uneducated. They're not as intelligent as white people. They're not going to be productive citizens. They'll be a burden on the state. So these were factors that kind of crossed the North and South divide. Back to the Townsends, the lawyer Cabanis was very good at his job, and long story short, when Samuel died in 1856 and the lawsuits over his will started coming, Cabanis was able to fight them off. It took 4 years, but in 1860, Samuel's children and Edmund's daughters were finally freed and began to inherit some of their father's fortune. Their names were Wesley, Caroline, Willis, Thomas, Charles Osborne, Parthenia, Milka, Joseph Bradford, Susanna, Elizabeth, and Virginia Townsend. And at that time, the youngest of them was 7 and the eldest 29 years old. These 11 individuals at the top here, along with a 12th woman named Elvira Townsend, were granted equal shares in a trust fund worth $200,000, the equivalent of $6 or $7 million today. Samuel's will also manumitted the surviving mothers of his children, as well as those women's children by enslaved partners, 45 individuals total. And that's just the start of the story. In the years and decades after their emancipation, members of the Townsend family migrated all across the country, attending school in Ohio, homesteading and fighting for civil rights in Kansas, mining for silver in Colorado Territory's Rocky Mountains, and in the case of one son, even returning to Alabama to purchase a piece of Samuel Townsend's old plantation where he and his family had once been enslaved. In all of these places, the Townsends were seeking communities where they could build new lives as free people, just like Nell, Ben, Mariah, and that unnamed black soldier in Bergen County. They were pursuing the American dream, but as you might imagine, it wasn't easy. The title of my book, Happy Dreams of Liberty, comes from a letter by a man named David Lakin, who was hired in 1860 to take members of the Townsend family safely out of Alabama and find homes for them in the free states. Lakin was a white Southerner, and he was not sympathetic to the Townsends. Frankly, he didn't think they should have been freed at all. Writing to Samuel Townsend's lawyer, Septimus Cabanis, Lakin said, quote, "They have happy dreams of liberty. But if they could realize how much more happy they would be back on an Alabama plantation, they would certainly be sad enough." The Townsends did not share that opinion, of course, but in Lakin's mind and in the minds of many white people that they would encounter over the course of their lives, their hopes for a better life in freedom were contemptuous, an illusion. In my book, I wanted to follow the Townsends in their lives and travels. I wanted to reconstruct their experiences under slavery in Alabama, their first years of freedom in Ohio, Kansas, and Colorado, and their struggles to prove men like Lakin wrong over the course of half a century. I started the research that would become this book in 2010 when I was an undergraduate at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. That's where I first encountered the Townsend family, and I have been thinking about them ever since. Now, maybe it's strange to spend more than a decade researching and writing and talking about one family that lived more than 150 years ago. After all, the Townsends were not major actors in the affairs of the nation. Their family background as the emancipated children of a wealthy cotton planter was complicated but not unique. They were ordinary people pursuing the same dreams that we still struggle for today: education, good jobs, home ownership, financial security. Sometimes they succeeded. Other times they met resistance in a society that considered their attempts offensive or contemptible. In some ways, I am aware, the Townsend story is a small one, but even small stories can have a powerful impact. Last summer, I was fortunate enough to be invited to a family reunion of Townsend descendants who can trace their ancestry back to Caroline Townsend Stone, the daughter of Samuel Townsend and an enslaved woman named Rainey. I am somewhere in the middle there. The family told me that my undergraduate research, which had ended up on the university's library website, had provided the first historical details anyone in the family had seen about Caroline's life in slavery. Those papers were also the first places they'd read the names of Caroline's parents, Samuel and Rainey. One man told me that the book gave him details about the richness of enslaved people's lives that he didn't often see in popular media. He said, the Townsends loved, they hated, they cheated, they made good decisions and bad decisions. They weren't just slaves, they were people. Comments like this prove to me how meaningful and relevant this kind of history, family and local history, can be in the present day, because that was my hope for the book and for all my research, to illustrate the humanity of people whose human dignity and rights were questioned and denied in their lifetimes. And I am, of course, not the only person doing this. Many New Jersey organizations have taken up that difficult but vital task of researching and sharing local Black history in the last several years. SAM, the museum I work for at Skillman, focuses on the African American community of central New Jersey from the 1700s to the present day. The New Jersey Historical Commission recently announced the historic sites that have been listed to the state's New Jersey Black Heritage Trail, and I am very proud that SAM is among them. The Lost Souls Project in East Brunswick is creating a public memorial to 137 African Americans who were illegally sold out of New Jersey and into the Deep South in 1818, after the passage of the Gradual Abolition Act, which made that sort of practice illegal. And your own Mahwah Historic Preservation Commission and Mahwah Museum are working to preserve that nearby enslaved people's cemetery. All of this is good news for many, many reasons, but one of them, I think, is because local history doesn't always get the attention it deserves. History is very complicated, as we all know, but these smaller stories can provide valuable new perspectives on that bigger picture. They give us insights into the complexity of history and the diversity of real people's experiences that are often lost in those broader narratives. And local stories are critical to understanding where we as individuals and where our communities fit into those broader narratives. No one in this room is personally responsible for slavery in New Jersey. We weren't alive then, so I don't want anyone leaving here feeling ashamed. What we are responsible for is what we do with this knowledge now that we have it, and that should be an empowering thought. By making the effort to learn more about the history of our communities and the long legacies of slavery that have shaped them, by getting involved with local historical organizations, or simply sharing what you've learned with friends and family, you are helping to push this work forward too. I thank you for that, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Hopefully there are some questions. Right. Well, the thing is, the lawyer who was in charge of being the executor of the estate and getting the money to these enslaved people, he didn't believe in it either. He wrote in letters, I don't think they should have been freed, but these individuals, there was a very interesting personality conflict between the racism that they clearly expressed in the historical documents we have and their sense of themselves as Southern gentlemen who upheld their word. If they give their word to something, they're going to do it. So there's that conflict. But I think the major reason is money talks. David Lakin, he got paid, and he got paid well. Cavanis, the lawyer, he got paid $3,000 a year for every year that he served as the executor of the estate. He made more money in 2 years than some of the Townsend children got from their inheritance over the course of their entire lifetimes because the Civil War devalued the property. And so on average, the descendants of Samuel Townsend received about $4,000 to $5,000 total from what they should have received. They should have had about $16,000 each. So, there was a great financial incentive to do this sort of thing, even if it went against their, ideologies personally. Yes?
Thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I wonder if it's possible for you to go back to the slide with the compilation of advertisements.
Absolutely. And we can look at some of these in more detail if you'd like. Some of these are from the one on the top right that's kind of obscured. That is Robert Finley and his wife, that advertisement. A couple in the front are from Princeton.
What I'm interested in is the one at the bottom.
Okay.
Was that published in New Jersey?
The one that says ran away from the subscriber in Sussex County?
Right.
Yes, so all of these were published in the New Jersey Gazette.
The reason I ask is that it mentions Mr. Rutherford in New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
Walter Rutherford was one of the board of proprietors of the state of New Jersey, and his son John was a surveyor general of the proprietors in the second Senate from New Jersey. And they had land in Sussex County, they had land in Lyndhurst, New Jersey, which is near the present town of Princeton, and they owned a vast tract of land in the mountains here in Mahwah.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested in that. Probably connects to, probably indicates that they were slaves.
Yeah, I have absolutely no doubt. It is entirely plausible and probably likely that it is the Mr. Rutherford is some Rutherford in that, in that family. There were, if you have any family pretty much in this period, in the pre-1804 period, that owns a big tract of land in New Jersey, they're almost certainly using enslaved labor to farm that land. And so this week, I was at a local living history farm in Central Jersey, Howell Living History Farm, and a group of 8th grade students were giving a presentation about research they had done about slavery that had taken place on that farm in the revolutionary and pre-revolutionary colonial periods. And that's something that I, even having lived there and done all this research, hadn't put the connection together. Oh, this is a large property, and the Phillips family, the white Phillips family, were not farming it on their own, right? Slavery was big business, a major contribution to the economy in the state. Yes. That's really interesting. I have not done a great deal of research about enslaved Native Americans in the region. Something that we do interpret and talk about at the museum where I work, SAM, is the connections between the African American and Native American population in that region, the free communities, not enslaved Native Americans. But, the Sourland Mountains, I don't know if anyone is familiar with the Sourlands here. Obviously, there aren't really mountains in New Jersey, but the Sourlands are an area that's geologically much rockier. The land is more acidic, so it's difficult to farm, and so it got this name from early settlers that it's sour. And so this land became kind of a home for displaced Native Americans in the area in Central Jersey, as well as free African Americans, because any white person with a little bit of money is not going to buy land in the Sourlands to farm. And so we do have cases such as in the Sourlands, in kind of the Central Jersey area, of connections and intermarriages between the Native American and African American communities in the 18th and 19th centuries, to the point in that specific community that in the 1880s, the New York Times reporter came down to visit the Sourlands and wrote an article describing what barbarians they are there in central New Jersey because there is racial mixing and there are people intermarrying and white people and black people are going to the same tavern. These are the poor whites who can't afford to live anywhere else. And so, these are interesting little pieces of history that can certainly bear more research. Unfortunately, I haven't done as much research into Native American history here.
What's interesting is that you looked at you received the Frederick Douglass Award and the Harriet Tubman Award. When you think about history, the fact that it's prominent now in history. At the same time, the 70th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education is coming up in terms of integration. And the fact that a lot of schools are not integrated, that people will think about blacks in terms of staying away, the criminals and so on, now realize that people are people and how important it is to be respectful of each other. And the fact that you brought up many of these things today, and how important it is to open up your ideas towards change and dialogue to make it a better world.
Thank you for saying that. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, New Jersey, I don't know if we are the most, or certainly one of the most segregated states in the nation when it comes to our school system, New Jersey. And so, that is something that's very much on my mind and on the mind of, I think, a lot of educators and a lot of interested members of the public. Something that I think really helps is when you do talk about this local history with younger age groups, right? I, had to wait till college to really learn about the history of slavery. I think that when you need to talk about different types of history, what some folks call difficult history, hard history, with younger groups. And, I spoke a moment ago about this presentation I witnessed at a living history farm with local 8th graders. This was part of a program called the Witness Stones Project. And the Witness Stones Project is a nonprofit organization that started in Connecticut and is now working with some schools in the Hopewell area in central Jersey, working with 8th graders to research enslaved people from their community. And then, produce artwork, produce presentations, historical essays about what they learned. And I think that the local history part of that project is what's really key. Because when you're talking about someone who lived at places you're familiar with, places you see in your town or in your community, names that you might be familiar with because they're on street signs or buildings, someone who was a part of your community however many hundreds of years ago, that, I think, really brings home the reality of the history in a way that maybe talking about some of the more famous figures or some of the more distant figures don't. We talk about Harriet Tubman, we talk about Frederick Douglass. Those are amazing stories, incredibly moving and, fantastic human beings. The bravest human beings I think we've ever seen. But when you talk about more obscure figures who are very local, that is valuable too, because it gives you that more personal connection. At least that's been my experience. And so I think that's something that I really love to see educators doing in, middle and high school grades. Yes.
When you were speaking about the state, it just dawned on me that we are the Garden State.
Mm-hmm.
So we were handmade for all of this to happen. And I also noticed that we are Dutch, the wealthy, who could afford all the land. When you talk about the Meadowlands, I'm talking about this part of the
Mm-hmm.
knowing that there are slaves buried underneath our roads and our buildings and in all the areas that were pig farms, were cow farms, where it just all just came together for me as you shared this. And if you look at all the churches that we have and their graveyards, just a 5-10 mile radius, you have to know in your heart that there are slaves somewhere nearby.
Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely right. And, what you mentioned about the Garden State, that name, is here for a reason. New Jersey was kind of a breadbasket colony for the mid-Atlantic states. We were producing a great deal of agriculture. When I was researching my book, unrelated to New Jersey as a topic, I was reading advertisements for peaches. Published in Kansas with folks trying to get people to move to Kansas. And they were saying, you can grow peaches here as flavorful as would tickle the palate of a Jersey man. And it just makes clear what New Jersey's reputation was. This was the Garden State. We produced the fruit, produced a great deal of agricultural products, and that made slavery so significant to the economy, as well as the fact that there were very large landholders who had the means to produce agriculture on a commercial scale rather than a subsistence or local scale. It was really the perfect storm. You're absolutely right. Yes, in the back.
Thank you for the presentation. It's actually very informative. The question I have is in the research that you're doing as a historian and working at the same center and so forth, has that in any way helped to contribute to information that the state of New Jersey is looking at in terms of reparations for enslaved Africans?
Yes, so our two founders at the museum, Beverly Mills and Elaine Buck, they've written two fantastic books that are available online on Amazon about history of slavery and African American communities in central New Jersey. They are on the reparations commission that has been kind of doing presentations and having focus group conversations throughout the state. Now, this is not an official state commission. It is not a government program, but it is a group that wants to, get the state talking about reparations and talking about these very important questions of, how do we repair this history? What do we do now that we know the history, and to talk about the potential material repercussions of that. And so, we do have folks associated with the museum who are doing that active work. Me personally, as a historian, my goal has always been to share as much information as possible so that folks who are leading that charge have all of the material they need to support their case. You know what I mean? If you were going to have a conversation about reparations, let's get you all of the research and all of the information to allow that conversation to take place in a productive way and to keep it from being, shove it under the rug, not talk about it. But public history folks in New Jersey are very much involved in that effort, although there has not been a lot of legislative progress to date. Yes.
My neighbor here, I'm interested in the churches in this area, some of which date back before the Civil War, and if you have any news for us about the role that Christianity played in the enslavement of human beings in the state of New Jersey.
That's a very interesting question. Now, I can't give you any details about your local churches because I'm not as familiar with this area of New Jersey. But when you think about religious history in New Jersey, something that's always going to come up is the Quaker presence. And so a lot of folks know that some Quakers, were some of the earliest abolitionists, some of the earliest anti-slavery activists, both in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey specifically. But even within that religious community, there was division. Some Quakers held slaves. Eventually, the, overall kind of consensus became you can't be in fellowship with us if you are slave owners. But at the period, of the Revolutionary War, when the first kind of waves of anti-slavery activism are spreading throughout the white community in New Jersey, there is this conflict. And so, there is no one religious denomination that can, stand up and say, I was always on the side of the good. There's no one religious denomination that we can say, was always on the side of slavery or bondage. Religion was used by slave owners and enslaved peoples for very different purposes. Slave owners who allowed preachers to speak to enslaved people, talk to them and, preach from the Bible, they chose very specific passages, the passages that say, obey your master, be a good servant, you'll be rewarded in the afterlife, just not this life. But enslaved people, looked at the Christian religion and drew inspiration from other sources. The story of Exodus. Harriet Tubman was called the Moses of her people because that was an inspirational story about, God's people being freed from bondage and freeing themselves from enslavement. So, Christianity has been used in different ways by different groups and individuals. And that's the case in New Jersey as well as anywhere else in the country. One interesting point, so because I've studied Princeton's history extensively, I can tell you about Samuel Davies, who was a university president before the Revolutionary War. And Samuel Davies was famous for preaching to enslaved people. He was one of the first white ministers to say, well, maybe we should be converting enslaved people, because at that time there was a much higher proportion of enslaved people in the area who came directly from Africa or from the Caribbean, who were not born in North America. And we saw that in some of the advertisements that I showed. And so, the process of converting enslaved people, Africans, to Christianity also led to a process of Africans and African Americans adapting Christian religion to their priorities, to their, belief in their ultimate liberation and, how that is shown in the Bible. So I think, there is a very strong push and pull that we see in this place as well as throughout the country. But New Jersey specifically, the Quaker influence is one of the more unique aspects of religious history here. So if you're going to look into this topic more deeply, that might be a theme that you see continue to come up. Yes.
I'd like to share in regards to the comments about the churches and the cemeteries. I'd just like to share that in regards to the churches and the cemeteries around here. There is a house on Island Road. It's a blue house. It had like 5 additions put on since it was established, like in the early 1700s. There's a church 100 yards down or so, which is the Mount Public Road Church. I was told by the owner of that blue house that there was a tunnel that led from his basement to the church, and it was to hide runaway slaves. And at that time, supposedly this whole area was a forest. So although the tunnel wasn't a long tunnel, it gave them a head start to hide and to get out into the woods and get out of it. And I've tried to find out more information about this, just looking online and so forth. And no one seems to be aware of this, right? I haven't found any information. And the gentleman that owns that house is down in his lands. And that house, he told me the tunnel was sealed up, I think in the 60s or the 70s, and during the World War. And so the department, the Public Works Department or whatever, they sealed that tunnel up. But it's my understanding that that tunnel went from there to the, I don't know if it went to the cemetery or it went to the church.
That's very interesting. And the fact that you haven't been able to find a lot of research on it, that is typical for studying stations on the Underground Railroad, which it sounds like this informally or perhaps formally may have been, this site. Because it was supposed to be a secret, people kept it secret. Frederick Douglass, in his multiple autobiographies, he doesn't share the details of the Underground Railroad because he doesn't want to get anyone in trouble. He doesn't want to jeopardize other enslaved people's chance to find freedom. And so because these were very well kept secrets, there are sites, like it seems like this house may have been, that may have been stations on the Underground Railroad that may have been involved in work similar to that, helping enslaved people escape bondage here in New Jersey, but we just don't know that much about them. There are other sites I have heard of throughout the state where there is oral history of, we have this basement here or this hidden room here because it was to hide enslaved people, and there's not that much information. But that is a testament to how well kept a secret it was and how successful that could be in its time. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I wish it were more, and it's probably going to go into the archives and find that, because this gentleman is now very old, and I'm sure that house will be up for sale.
Must be more stops around the railroad.
It may have been, yeah. I think I saw a hand back there.
Yes, I wonder if you come across any of the records of the overseers of the poor in New Jersey. Other than, we have some here, but I wonder if you found them elsewhere.
No, I have not looked into that. That's a really interesting avenue of research because, I talked about the Gradual Emancipation Act that was passed in 1804 and the various restrictions that kept people enslaved. It also put some enslaved people into very strange intermediate positions, right? The individuals who were born after the date that would allow you to be freed in that period of 21 to 25 years, they're not slaves, they're not free, they're called apprentices for life. And there are other cases of African Americans or enslaved people, or not enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, who are considered unable to support themselves. They become, imprisoned as vagrants or seen as charges on the state, expenses for the state, and so they end up in poorhouses. And so those sort of intermediate circumstances, I think that's a really interesting way to research that group of individuals and that type of bondage that wasn't slavery but wasn't freedom either, because that certainly existed in New Jersey as one of these states with a very, very gradual emancipation process. There was that in-between period where things are changing but very slowly, and you might be hard-pressed to see the difference between apprenticeship and slavery.
The reason I ask is that the Mahwah Museum has a facsimile copy of the Overseers of the Poor from about 1790 to 1837. And there is evidence in there of abandonment of children to the Overseers of the Poor, of families that we would have familiar names with. Which is obviously an indication, a further indication of slavery is important here in Mahwah.
What museum did you say?
The Mahwah Museum.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, we have a representative from the Mahwah Museum here today. Any other questions? Oh, we see one in the back.
Sort of a question, but I had a grandfather that was born in 1848, and I think his mother, what I found in census, I just didn't know that her name, so I don't know whether she was born here, but I understand even grandmother was here, so somebody was born here as slaves, but he wasn't slaves, so I haven't been able to find out, is there any census before? Now his mother, I didn't find anything in the census on her name, and I'd like to find out a little more, because I'm 91, I'd like to know whether there was people family before, I'm still here. I just wondered about the census.
So there were censuses annually taken by the federal government from 1790 forward. But if, these individuals were enslaved, they wouldn't have shown up on the normal census, right? It would have been the enslaver's name. Now, if you know the last name, and if that last name can be associated with perhaps a white family in the area, you might be able to identify perhaps your ancestor, your grandfather's mother or grandmother was enslaved by that family, and you could start looking at those records specifically. If you know if that individual was associated with a church, or if you look at local churches, African Americans, even enslaved people, could be members of churches in various Christian denominations, and so those names might be listed in church records. So that is another potential place that you might look in addition to census data.
Yeah, I looked in our church records, my grandmother was in church, and I know from family history that they were encouraged when they to go to church, and but I don't see his name on any records, and I wonder how I can find out.
Yeah, I mean, that just speaks to the difficulty and the limitation that researchers like you have trying to trace that genealogy because the sources are so limited. I wonder, so do you know the name of your grandfather who was born in 1848 of either of their parents? Do you have that name?
I have the name of the mother and father.
Okay, so technically, what was supposed to happen after that 1804 law was passed was that if you were a slave owner and there was an enslaved person born to you who would qualify to be freed by the terms of that law, born in 1804 and after, you had to have that birth registered. And so there are registries per county, with the births of enslaved people. And so if they were born in New Jersey after July 4th, 1804, their names might appear on those registers. And then that sometimes gave the mother's name as well as the enslaver's name. So that could be another place to look. Now, of course, not all slaveholders did what the law told them they were supposed to do, and some records have been destroyed. But if you haven't looked in that direction, that could be another resource.
And it wasn't much talk about in our family, so I was growing up, because my grandmother, back in the 30s, when I see her, she's a white woman, and she was a descendant of the Southern women. So these things weren't just, they were just taken from us, they were taught.
Right, yeah. And that makes it so difficult to find. Mhm. Well, thank you for sharing that. I wish you the very best luck. I know how difficult that work is. All right. Well, thank you so much. I also want to note, I have flyers up here for the museum I work for, Sam's Juneteenth event. It's our 3rd annual celebration. It's on Saturday, June 15th. This is our biggest event of the year. We're on a historic site, a historic AME church and a farmstead that has been owned by an African-American family since the mid-1800s. So this might be one of the only Juneteenth celebrations that you can find that'll take place on historic African-American owned land. So I encourage you to come take a flyer, and I also have books for sale if you're interested. So thank you again.
I just want to thank everybody again for coming. I want to thank the library for hosting us today. I love this place and everything that happens here, so thank you. And I'd love to thank the Mahwah Museum, which was a co-presenter with us. I know many of you are members. And if you want to follow the Historic Commission, we're on Facebook. And I also want to let you know we do have an opening on the Historic Preservation Commission. There are certain spots available for people who live outside of the township, if you have an expertise in history or architecture or construction. And if you just love local history and would like to get involved, you can see me.
Repeat that again, please.
That we have an opening on the Mahwah Historic Preservation Commission. There are some positions that are available for people who live outside of the township if you have an expertise in history or construction or architecture. If you live in town and just would love to learn more about what we do and how to get involved, just come talk to me. So thank you again. And thank you, that was fantastic. I just have a million more questions, so I'm gonna follow up with those books you recommended. Thank you.